All right, we're good. Just position it and it's recording already. Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're at the very top of Daf Ches Amud Aleph, a totally new sugya. Amar Reb Zera, Amar Shmuel, Libein Sakin v'shachat ba shchitaso keshera. Why? Because chidud is kodem lelibuna. If a person, now we know, look, if you were to take a quartering iron and apply it to the animal's neck, that would not be a kosher shchita. You'd be burning the animal instead of shechting the animal, right? So that would be render the animal a treifa. But what if you were to take a shchita knife and heat it up in the fire so that it gets red hot? And then with that you shecht the animal, but you make an incision with a red hot instrument, a red hot blade.
That's how surgery's done these days.
Yeah, because they want to cauterize it while as they go, right?
Yeah, but don't they need the blood to come out after?
So the blood will come out, but the question is, it's an academic question. Is that called a kosher shchita or not? So you're not really going to cauterize. You can't possibly cauterize the huge arteries of a cow or a sheep when you're shechting it just because the knife is red hot. The blood will come out, but the question is, have you burned the animal or have you slaughtered the animal? Is that a kosher shchita or not? So the Gemara says it is a kosher shchita. Why? Because the incision precedes the cauterization. The incision precedes the burning. And therefore, so the Gemara then says, but wait a minute, v'ha'ikat stadin. But 1 second, in the course of inserting the knife into the animal's neck, invariably the sides of the knife are going to be burning the simanim, the trachea and the esophagus that have to be severed. So isn't that burning going to mar the shchita? So the Gemara says no, because beis hashchita miravach ravach. Because when you make the incision, the tissue naturally splits apart. And I mean, I've never done shchita myself, but I've done a lot of bris milah. And I can tell you that whenever you make an incision into living tissue, the tissue spreads apart from the incision. And so that's what the Gemara is basically saying, is that the incision, the tissue pulls away from the incision so that the blade on the sides never actually burns or cauterizes the surrounding tissue. So now the question is, yes?
I'm just wondering about the temper of the heating up might take the temper out of the blade. That's what I was wondering.
It might take, you mean because it might compromise the sharpness of the blade. So the Gemara doesn't really take that into account. It's an interesting point, though. Now the Gemara is asking a non-CHULLIN question. It's asking a tzara'as question. We know that there are two halachas that are described in the Torah about a person who sustains an injury, and as a result of that injury, he gets tzara'as on his skin. There are two types of trauma that can occur to the skin that can cause a remaining tzara'as lesion. One is a burn, and one is a blunt impact of an object. Okay, so either one can result in tzara'as. The one that's called the result of a blunt impact is called shchin, and the one that's a result of a burn is called a michvah. So the question now is, what if you, what would be the halacha if you take a red hot poker and you strike a person's skin? You're now getting two things. You're getting heat and you're getting a blunt impact. What is the status of the lesion that results as a result of that hot poker striking the person? Is it a shchin or is it a michvah? So the Gemara says, L'may nafkamina. What difference does it make? So the Gemara says, L'chidatanya. I'll tell you. Now, this is a long explanation, but by the end of the next several lines, we'll see why it makes a difference. Shchin u'michva mitamein b'shavua echad b'shnei simanim b'seir lavan u'v'pisyon. There are the two types of injuries, shchin and michva, have the same halachic status exactly. And that is that when the Kohen first sees it, he has to seclude the person in isolation for a week. If after a week the lesion has spread, so then he declares him to be an absolute, a mitzorah muchlat, a definitive mitzorah. If the lesion has not spread, so then he does not have to enclose him for a second week. He basically says, you're tahor. Now, what are the two types of spreading of the lesion that define it as a tsaras? He has to have two things in the enlarged area of the lesion. It has to have a white hair, plus it has to have pisyon. The skin has to spread in size to be more inclusive in the whiteness of the lesion. V'lama chalkan hakasuv. So then, if they have the exact same halachic status as far as the way that the Kohen determines whether it's tsaras or not, why then does the Torah devote two separate paragraphs to something that is essentially the same? The Torah could have just said shchin o michva, but instead the Torah devotes one paragraph to shchin and one paragraph to michva. So why does the Torah do that? Lomar she'ein mitzdarfin zeh im zeh. It's to tell you that if I have half the requisite size of a shchin and half the requisite size of a michva that are adjacent to each other, the Kohen does not declare that to be tsaras. How much of a size do you need in order to be a lesion to be deemed tsaras? It has to be the size of a gris. What is a gris? It's a half of a certain bean called a pool, which the Gemara knows about. A certain kind of Middle Eastern bean. If it's half the size of that bean, it constitutes a lesion of tsaras. Now, what if you have half of that of a michva and half of that of a shchin? Half of it is a result of a burn, half of it is a result of a blunt, dull impact. So the halacha is that even though you have a full gris, it's not deemed to be tsaras because it came as a result of two different sources. So let us now take this further. V'tanya ezehu shchin ve'ezehu. I'm sorry. V'laman chalkan hakasav lamar shemin star from zeim zeh. V'tanya ezehu shchin ve'ezehu michva, and the Brisa then clarifies what is the definition of a shchin and what is the definition of a michva. Laka be'etz be'evan be'gefes b'chami tveria v'chol davar shelo b'machma sa'or li'isui ever mi'ikaro zehu shchin. The definition of a shchin is anything that comes either as a result of blunt impact or as a result of heat that is not caused by fire. But sometimes heat can be caused by geothermal energy and other things. So it either is a strike that a person sustained from wood or from stone or from brimstone, or if he was scalded by the well springs of Tiberia, the Tiberias well springs, which are hot springs, or anything else that is hot but is not a result of heating from fire, but rather is geothermal in nature, such as if, let's say, molten lava that is lead, molten lead strikes a person, but it came from the ground as lava and was not heated up. So those things would constitute a shchin because they were not caused from something heated by fire. Ve'ezehu michva, nichva bagacheles beremetz besid roseach begafosis roseach v'chol davar haba machma sa'or le'isuye chamei ha'or zehu michva. And what is the definition of a michva? Anything that the injury is caused by something heated in fire. And then the Gemara lists like coals and hot ash and other things that are heated up by fire, let's say in a kiln, that you heat them up as building materials and things like that, like plaster and stuff like that, or anything else that's heated by fire, including heated water. Like if you take scalding water that's from that's heated up by a fire, let's say in a boiler, and that spills on a person's skin, and that causes the lesion, that's called a michva.
Anything from nature.
Anything from fire,
From
anything
nature,
that's heated.
Shechin.
Shechin happens naturally.
From nature.
If the heat is caused by nature, that's why I said geothermal heat, and this is by fire. Vitanya, shechinu michva, im shechin kodem lemichva bitel michva es hashchin, v'michva kodem es l'shchin, bitel shchin es hamichva. So we have another brisa that says, let's say something that causes a shchin strikes a person's arm, and on the very same spot right afterwards, something that causes a michva strikes the person on the very same place. So the halacha is that whatever comes last overrules the thing that came first, and that's what predominates, and therefore if a shchin blow comes first and then a michvah burn comes after on the very same place, it's deemed halachically as a michvah, and if vice versa, it's deemed halachically as a shchin. V'hacha heichi dami. So we're still trying to prove our point. So why does this make a difference whether a hot poker that strikes a person is a shchin or a michvah? So the question is like this. Kagon, the following illustration. Dahaba bechatzi grish shchin me'ikara, v'li bein shapud v'hikabo, v'nafak bechatzi gris acher, mai. Chavata kadim v'asi havalo u'mevatale lechavata v'habale shchin u'michva v'lo mitztarfin, Odilma chavala kadim v'asi chavatu mevatale lahavla v'havale shchin u'shchin mitzdaref. So the question is like this. A person had on his arm a lesion from a shchin injury. Remember, from that blunt impact, right? But it's a half the requisite size. It's a half of a gris. And then right afterwards, a person takes a poker and strikes him on the healthy skin that's immediately adjacent to the shchin injury. And that also causes a half a gris of a lesion. And the question therefore is as follows. You've got heat and you've also got impact. So which predominates in that strike from the poker? Is it that the heat comes first and then the impact comes second, in which case we would view it as a shchin blow, and therefore it is conjoined together with the pre-existing shchin, and they make up a full gris, and therefore the person has tsaras? Or do we say that the impact comes first and then the heat comes second, so the heat predominates, and therefore we would say that it is a heat injury and not an impact injury, and therefore since the adjacent injury is from impact and not heat, heat and impact do not join together. Shchin and michvah do not join together, and therefore it's not tsaras. So that's basically the reason why this is a relevant question. You strike someone with a hot poker, is it a shchin injury or is it a michvah injury? So Tashma, the Omer Reb Zera Omar Shmuel, li bein sakin v'shachat ba shchitasu kshera, chiduda kodem lelibuna, alma chavata kodem. So now the answer can be based on what we just learned before, that if you shecht with a hot knife, if you shecht with a heated knife, what did we say? It's a kosher shchita because the incision precedes the heat. And since the incision precedes the heat, the animal is receiving a kosher shchita. So what does that prove to you? That when you take a hot poker, the heat precedes the shchin, the impact, and therefore we say that if heat comes first and then impact, we view it as an impact injury, we view it as a shchin injury, and therefore in the illustration you just provided, this person should be deemed to be a mitzorah, because he's got half of a gris of a shchin already, and now he's got the other half of the shchin. So what do we want to say? Chiduda kodem lelibuna. I'm sorry, just the opposite. The impact precedes the heat. In other words, what came first? The incision came before the heat. So if the incision came before the heat, in the case of the hot poker, the impact comes before the heat as well. And therefore you view this additional poker strike as a heat injury, and therefore it does not join together with the shchin, and therefore the person is not a mitzorah. Alma chavata kadim. So the Gemara says that's not necessarily a raya, because the Gemara says chidud shiny, because the Gemara says no. Maybe there's an inherent difference between an incision that's made gently with a knife versus a blunt impact injury made with a poker. Because the difference being is that when you make the incision with a knife, since you're gently incising into the tissue, that's what precedes the heat. That's why it comes first. But if you're hitting someone with a blunt object, maybe the bluntness of that impact is not felt until after the heat. And therefore, maybe we would view that as blunt injury coming after the heat, in which case it would be tsaras. And therefore, you have no answer to your question. Tashma, but let's look at the next brisa. Li bein shbud v'hikabo nidon mishum michvas eish, alma chavata kadim. We're going to try to prove the same thing from a brisa which explicitly addresses our case. It says that if you heat a poker and then you strike a person with that poker, so the halacha is that that is deemed to be a michvah. That's deemed to be a burn lesion, and not a shchin lesion. So what do you see from here? You see that we look at the impact comes first, and then the heat comes second, and that's why the heat predominates, and we view it as a heat injury and not as an impact injury. So therefore, in the illustration that you provided, since we view it as a heat injury and not as an impact injury, so he would not be a mitzorah, because the half a gris that he had before is shchin, this new half gris is a michvah. They don't mix, they don't match. So the Gemara says that's not a raya, because hasam nami de barziye mivraz dahainu chidud. So the Gemara says maybe that brisa is not talking about where you struck a person with a poker. Maybe it's talking about where you take a hot poker from the fire and then you gently place it on the person's skin. Maybe that's the reason why the brisa says. That's the reason why the brisa says that you're judged as a burn, because there was no impact. But it could be that in the case that we're describing, where there's impact and heat, then the thing that dominates is the impact and not the heat. So the Gemara basically leaves that as being an unresolved question. I have this image in my mind. I must think I once saw a movie about a guy who had a hot poker placed on his skin. I'm just thinking about that image. But anyway, that's the thing. Okay, Hummer.
I thought with saras, it's a nega that is caused by something else, but this seems to be a nega that's arrived by another means, and
through an injury.
It's not really saras.
No, it is saras. If you look in Parshas Tazria, the Torah itself, and take a look, I think it's in Perek Yud Gimel, Yud Dalet, and Vayikra. Take a look in Parshas Tazria. You'll see the Torah says that you can get saras as a result of injury.
Okay.
And the two injuries is heat or blunt impact. Okay? Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avuha. Sakin shel avodas kochavim mutter lishchot ba va'asr lachtoch ba basar. So Rav Nachman says a very surprising statement. He says if you have a knife that is for avodah zarah. Now, what do we know the features of avodah zarah? You're not allowed to benefit financially from avodah zarah, right? So can I use this knife to shecht with? So he says, yes, you're allowed to shecht with that knife. Now, why should that be? Aren't you getting benefit from it? So he says, you're allowed to shecht, but you're not allowed to cut meat that's already, let's say, from a dismembered animal. You're not allowed to cut the meat of that animal with that knife. So let's explain. Mutter lishchot ba mekalkalu va'asr mekalkalu kama va'asr lachtoch ba basar because misakenu. So the Gemara explains, why are you allowed to shecht? Because in most situations, you're depreciating the value of the animal by shechting it. When an animal is alive, it could be used for schlepping, it could be used for its fleece, it could be used for a number of different things. Now, by shechting it, you've immediately depreciated that animal so it can only be used for meat, and therefore you're not getting financial benefit, you're getting financial detriment through that knife, and therefore it's allowed to be used. But when it comes to cutting meat, of course, you want to be able to put the cubes of beef in the stew, so you're getting definite benefit from cutting the meat into smaller pieces. And therefore, that's beneficial, and therefore it's aser. Amar Rava, pa'amim shahashochet aser b'misukenes u'mechatech muter ba'at miyeh dekayomin l'korbana. So the Gemara says, but wait a minute, says Rava, it is a bit subjective. It depends on the situation. In a situation, let's say, you're saying that shechita is mutter because you're depreciating the animal, not in all situations. There are situations where, let's say, an animal is deathly ill, such that if you don't shecht it, it's going to die imminently from natural causes. So there, shechting the animal is a financial benefit, not a financial detriment, because you can't use the animal for anything else. So there, you wouldn't be allowed to use the avodah zarah knife.
But you can't check the treifa, can you?
It's not a treifa. Animals that are going to die from old age are still, they're not...
Well, it's not sick, it's just...
It's not sick, it's imminently going to die. So it's an alter behema. It's just an old animal, right? So and then I'll give you an opposite example. I'll give you an example where you're actually getting financial detriment by cutting up a piece of meat. You know why? Like in the old world, just think about Henry VIII's table. You take a big bone and take a chunk of a bite out of it, right? So in the old world, you would present a king a gazunta piece of meat, like they have these things now called tomahawk steaks. Have you heard of that? It's like a huge thing on the bone.
$500.
Right, it's a huge thing on a bone. So if I were to take a tomahawk steak, which is worth $500, let's say, Mendel, whatever it's worth, and I was to cut it into tiny pieces, I would be depreciating the value of the steak. So in that situation, you would be allowed to cut with an avodah zarah knife because you're depreciating and not benefiting in value. Now, frek the Gemara, v'tepokle mishum shamnunis di isura. So the Gemara says, shkoyach, you found a scenario where you'd be allowed to cut with an avodah zarah knife because of you're not getting financial benefit. But there should be another reason why it should be aser, which is if you've used this knife already for shechting or cutting up avodah zarah items, what about the residual fat that may be lingering on the knife from its previous use, which was used for a forbidden substance, which was for avodah zarah? So why don't we say that that knife is forbidden because it's not kashered? So the Gemara answers, b'chadasha. We're talking about a new knife, meaning that it was designated for avodah zarah, but it was never used. The Gemara says, but wait a minute, b'chadasha, bein l'Rebbi Yishmael, bein l'Rebbi Akiva, misham she'avodas kol chavim heimu, misham she'avodas kol chavim einan asurin ad she'yevdu. 1 second. There's a machlokes when you designate an animal for worship for avodah zarah, or a statue for worship. There's a machlokes, Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, whether that object becomes aser even before it's worshipped. But everyone agrees that if it's just an accoutrement, an accessory for avodah zarah, then everyone agrees that it's not aser bahana until it's actually used. So if it's a brand new knife that's just been designated for avodah zarah, so what's wrong with using it? So ibayis ema depasuk be gavazel avodas kol chavim, the ibayis ema be yashana shalibna ba'or. So the Gemara says, you're right, I have to modify it. It doesn't mean that it's brand new out of the package. It means that it's brand new in the sense that it's been used for avodah zarah, but it's never been used for meat. It's been used as for avodah zarah to, let's say, cut up pieces of wood. So there's no residual of forbidden substance on the knife. And that's why if you can figure out a way that you're not getting financial benefit from it, you're allowed to cut up pieces of meat with it. Alternatively, even if it was used for meat or for slaughter previously, you could still use it because we're talking about a knife that had been kashered. You had libun, it was put in the fire, all residual substance that may have lingered on the knife from its previous use was burnt off, and therefore you can use it now. Itzmar. Now we're getting into the subject of kashering stuff. We're going to see a little bit more of that today. Hashochet besakin shel ovdei kochavim. Rav Omar Koilef v'Rabba Bar Barchana Omar Mediach. Now, if I take a knife that was previously used for avodah zarah, and here we're talking about a knife where there's a suspicion that there may have been some residual fat from its previous use for avodah zarah animals. So, in that situation, like I used it for ritual slaughter for an avodah zarah. So, in that situation, there's a suspicion that there's residual fats on the surface of the knife. So there's a machlokus over here as to if I do use it b'di'eved, what's the status of the animal that I've slaughtered? So the halacha is it's a machlokus. One says that you have to scrape off the surface of with the place of the incision because there may have been a transfer of some of the residual fats from the avodah zarah animal that may have transferred into the new animal that has been freshly slaughtered. So the way you remove that is to scrape off just the surface of the place of the incision, so you're getting rid of any attachment from the previous use. And the other opinion says, no, just rinse it off with water and it's fine. You don't have to scrape off the surface layer. You can just rinse it off with water and it's fine. So the Gemara says, this is very interesting. Lema Bahakamiflagi. Demar Savar Beis Hashchita Tsonein, Umar Savar Beis Hashchita Roseach. Perhaps the machlokas between these two opinions is what is the halachic status of the temperature of the animal's neck at the time of slaughter. The Gemara puts forth a position that at the moment when you slaughter an animal, because of the great pressure and the great amount of outflow of blood, this heats up the area of the throat which is being slaughtered, and it causes such a heat that it could cause heat transfer, just like when you're cooking something on the fire. And therefore, according to one opinion, the heat is so great that there can be transfer from the forbidden knife to the surface of the animal's throat, and therefore you have to scrape it off. And the other opinion says, no, it's tzonin. It's viewed as halachically being cool, and therefore any transfer that is made can be rinsed off with water. Maybe that's the machlokas. So the Gemara says, lo, dekuli alma beis hashchita rotzeachu, man do'amar koilev shapir, uman do'amar mediach, adi de tridi simon lafu kedam lo bali. So the Gemara says not necessarily. It could be that that's not what they're arguing about. It could be that everyone agrees that the place of the shchita is considered to be hot halachically. So what's the machlokes? If you hold that you have to scrape off the layer that was directly touching the knife, it's because of the heat transfer. The other opinion says you just have to rinse it off. It says there's no transfer despite the heat, because since the arteries are pumping out blood so quickly right after the incision, that pushback from the pumping blood prevents any absorption of forbidden substance into the surrounding tissue.
The blood washes it itself.
Well, the Gemara doesn't say the issue of blood washing it, but it says sort of the blood prevents any absorption of forbidden substance into the tissue. That's the way the Gemara describes it. So I'm not sure exactly if you call it washing but I'm just translating the way the Gemara describes it. Ika da Amri, others learn, Dekule alma beis hashchita tzaynei, man dormer mediach shapir, man dormer koileif agav duchka desakina bola. So the Gemara says, I'll give you another explanation. Some say that the explanation is that no, both opinions hold that it's halachically cool in the area of the shchita. Why then do you have to, so if you hold you just have to rinse it off, that makes good sense because there's no absorption, because there's no heat transfer. If you hold that you do have to scrape off the surface layer, why should that be if it's just cool? So the answer is because something called duchka de sakina, which is going to come up many times in halacha and is going to come up many times in maseches chulin. When pressure is placed on a substance from a blade, even in the absence of heat, there can sometimes be transfer of flavor and substance from the knife to the object. For example, in modern halacha, we have this concept, if you're cutting a sharp substance like a davar charif, like if you're cutting a lemon or an onion, so the halacha is that because you have something called duchka de sakina, pressure from the knife, the status of the knife transfers into the onion. So if you have a fleishach knife and you push down on the blade on the onion, so even though there's no heat and it's all cool, we nevertheless say the onion becomes fleishach. Okay, so that's the similar idea over here, and that's why they hold that you have to scrape off just the surface layer because there's been some transfer because of pressure from the knife. Now, let's go on to the next discussion. Sakin treifa. What if I take a kosher knife that was used previously to slaughter an animal that was a treifa animal? So, pligi ba Rav Acha v'Ravina. Chad omer b'chamin v'chad omer b'tzonin. So this too is a machlokes between two amoraim. One says that you have to kasher the knife by doing haga'ala, which is by putting it in boiling water. The other opinion says, no, just rinse it off and it's totally kosher. The hilchasa afilu b'tzonin. And the Gemara says, over here we're prepared to paskin, that in this situation, even though we equivocate on the previous case because we're dealing with such a strong isser of avodah zarah, but over here, since it's not avodah zarah, it's just a question of surface fat that may have lingered from the previous shchita, which was from a treifa animal, we're going to be lenient in paskin that you just have to rinse it off with water and it's okay. V'i'ika blisa de parsa lemichbere lo tzarich. And we'll go even further. If you don't have water available, just take a rough piece of fabric and wipe it down, and that's also just as good as cleaning it with water. In other words, basically the Gemara is suggesting that when it comes to this kind of situation, we don't have to worry that the beis hashchita is hot and that there's an absorption of material inside the knife itself, but rather there's just surface residue from the previous shchita. So either rinse it off or wipe it down with a rough piece of fabric, which will get rid of all of the residue.
Actually, the Gemara doesn't mention putting it to the ground.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? The Gemara doesn't talk about that over here. It's mentioned elsewhere. Ulaman da'amar bechamin my time mishum de kabbalah isura mishum de kabbalah isura. So the Gemara says, now if you hold that you do have to kasher it by doing hagala, by putting it in hot water, The reason is because not only is there surface residue, but there's absorption through heat. Because that opinion holds that the Beis HaShchita gets actually halachically hot, and therefore causes an absorption of blood from a treifa to go into the body of the knife itself, and therefore it has to be kashered through Hagala. Well, if that's the argument, the hetera nami bola ever min achai. So the Gemara says, well, then why don't you have a similar problem anytime you do shchita, even with a kosher animal, a non-treifa animal? I mean, think about it for a second. You are slaughtering a living animal, right? Now, over the course of the shchita, which may take a couple of seconds, you're converting that animal from a living animal into a slaughtered animal that's now kosher. But at the beginning of the incision, the animal is still a living animal. So any blood that will absorb into the knife at the beginning of the incision is coming from a living animal whose blood is usher because of Ever Min Achai, because you're taking from a living creature. So why don't we say that any time you slaughter, according to this opinion, that there's absorption, anytime you slaughter even a kosher animal, the knife should have to be kashered every time after the slaughter because it absorbs Ever Min Achai blood into the body of the knife. So the Gemara says, Emas bola lechi chayma, Emas chachayma lechi gamr shchita hayishaita heterahava. So the Gemara says, no, it's not a problem. You know why? Because at what point do we deem the area of the shchita to get halachically hot enough to cause absorption? That only happens at the end of the shchita. And by that time, any blood that is going to be absorbed in is kosher blood from a slaughtered animal. And therefore you don't have to kasher. Even according to the more stringent opinion, you wouldn't have to kasher a knife that was used for shchita for a kosher animal. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav hatabach tzarich shlosha sakinin. A related issue. Every butcher. Now remember, in the old world, a butcher was also the shaychet. This 20th century phenomenon, or maybe it's a little bit earlier than that, maybe 19th or 20th century. This phenomenon that you had one guy who was the rabbi with the long beard, who's the shaychet, and another guy who's the reseller of the meat. That's not the way it worked in the times of the Gemara. The guy who shechted it was the guy who sold it. He raised the cattle, he shechted it, and then he sold it. What?
I mean, what if, usually when you have your own business, you have to get somebody else that's going to...
So that whole issue of whether you have to check the animal bichlal is something that you're going to learn about in CHULLIN. This requirement that we have, that you have to examine the animal afterwards, and it has to be under rabbinical supervision, and all these other things, these are all post-Talmudic, right? But remember, the person selling the meat is also the shaychet. And if you trust the shaychet because he's a God-fearing Jew, you can also trust him to sell it to you. So the halacha is that every butcher should have 3 separate knives. One is exclusively for shchita. Now that, of course, we know, because if we allow to use it for other things, what could happen? The knife could develop pigimos. It could develop nicks and dullness, and therefore he would inadvertently not notice it, and he would invalidate the shechita. So he's got to have a separate knife for slaughter. Then he's got to have a separate knife for hacking the meat, for cutting the meat into pieces that he can sell to his customers. What's the third knife for? The third knife is to cut the forbidden fats, because he has to cut that into sections to be able to sell it to the market to be used for fuel, right? So you've got to have 3 knives: shchita, kosher meat, and the non-kosher byproduct, which is the chalev, that also has to be cut up for selling as well.
Any difference between among them? The same, exactly. All
You mean the knives?
Identify.
You'll see in just a second. So the Gemara now says, so echas sheshochet ba ve'echas shemachatech ba basar ve'echas shemachatech ba chalavim. So the Gemara's question now is v'liskein leichada v'lichtoch ba basar v'hadu lichtoch ba chalavim. So the Gemara says, I don't understand why you need 3 knives. I understand you need a separate knife for shechita. That I get. But why not have the same knife when you shecht an animal, have just 1 knife, and you'll dismember the meat, and then you'll dismember the chalev. And then you can always kosher it afterwards, or clean it afterwards. But why do you require him to have 2 separate knives? Just tell him to do it in the sequence, such that he'll cut the kosher stuff up first, and then he'll cut up the non-kosher stuff afterwards. And then there won't be a problem. So the Gemara says, Gzeira shemayachtel chalovim v'achar kach basar. So the Gemara says, because we're worried. He may get confused. He may get, he may lose track of what he's doing. and cut up the chaylev before the meat, and then before you know it, he's going to have residue of chaylev, forbidden chaylev on the knife, and he'll cut up kosher meat without even knowing it. That's why we require them to have two separate knives. Now, if you were to ask your wife this question, why do you have need two separate knives? Like she would say, what kind of question is that? And then she would throw you out of the kitchen. But anyway, hashtanami michlech. But the Gemara says, but even with two knives, if you're concerned about confusion, why aren't you concerned that he'll get the knives mixed up? Because maybe they're identical. So the Gemara answers, Kaven da'atzrechinu trei islei hekera. So the Gemara says, no, the fact that you need two knives, this will cause the butcher to recognize which knife is for which. In other words, invariably, even if they're identical, they didn't manufacture these things in Taiwan, right? These knives. They were not like, there's no production line for the making of knives. Every knife was custom made, so you can recognize which is my knife for chaylev, which is my knife for meat, and then you'll know, and you won't get confused the two. V'amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav hatabach tzar shnei kelim shel mayim echad shemediach bo basar ve'echad shemediach bo chalavim. Similarly, you need to have two buckets of water whenever you're processing an animal, because you have to rinse off both the meat and the fat from from the surface blood. We know that, right? And we'll talk about koshering later on. But in any event, you need to have two buckets of water, one for rinsing off the meat and one for rinsing off the fat. Why? Because if we just require one bucket, if you rinse off the fat, you're going to have globules of fat remaining in the water, and if afterwards you rinse off the meat, the globules of forbidden fat will possibly adhere to the kosher meat and trafe it up. So therefore you need to have two separate buckets. So the Gemara says, V'niskan leichada v'nadiach bo basar v'hadar nadiach bo chalavim. Gzeira shema yadiach chalavim v'achar kach basar. Why don't we just tell you have one bucket per animal that you shecht, and just rinse off the meat before you rinse off the fat, and therefore you'll avoid all the problems. So the Gemara says, no, same concern. You may get famished, you may get confused, and you'll inadvertently rinse off the fat before the meat, and then you'll have problems. So the Gemara says, hashtanami michle filei. So the Gemara says, well, if you're worried about a guy forgetting, even if you require two buckets, he could get confused and use the chaylev bucket for the meat and vice versa. So the Gemara says, no. Keven ta'atzrechine tarti islei hekera. Same answer is that, again, two buckets, there is invariably going to be some recognizable difference between the two. And you'll remember which bucket, the bucket with the dent is for the meat, and the bucket with the hole or the whatever is for the chaylev. Amar Ameimar Mishmeida Rav Papa lo lischof inish kefale iluye bisra dedoiv tarba ubale bisra. So I don't know the exact anatomy because I've never really gotten into the innards of an animal, but the Gemara basically says like this. There's the forbidden fat that rests above the kidneys. And what you're not allowed to do is once you've dismembered the flank that has the forbidden fat, don't place it on top of a piece of kosher meat. And the reason is because especially with freshly slaughtered meat, it's warm, and the warm meat will dissolve some of the fat and will absorb some of the fat, some of the forbidden fat, and that'll absorb into the meat and trafe up the meat. So the Gemara says, "Ihachi ki teritzi nami do ivtarba ubola bisra." So the Gemara says, well, if you're concerned about that, then even if the flank of the animal that has the forbidden fat is resting normally, it hasn't been placed on another piece of meat, but it's just resting normally on the adjacent flesh that is next to it, why aren't you concerned that some of the fat will melt and absorb into the kosher substance that's adjacent to it? So the Gemara says, because karma mafsik mitasoy. The answer is because the point of connection between the forbidden fat and the kidney and other tissue that's surrounding it, there's a membrane that prevents the fat, even when it is melting, from absorbing into the adjacent tissue. And therefore the adjacent tissue will remain kosher. So ihachi me'ilayi nami karma ika. So the Gemara says, well, if that's your argument, then why don't you say that there's a top membrane on the top of the fat also that prevents it from spreading out and diffusing into the meat that you'll place it on top of? So the Gemara answers, Aidi demimash misha yada detavcha mifates. So the Gemara answers, you're right, there is a top membrane as well. But the difference is that once the butcher starts handling the pieces of of body parts, he breaks down the membrane through human intervention, through just through handling. The membrane breaks down, that surface membrane on top of the fat, and therefore if you would allow him to place it on top of a freshly cut piece of meat, the meat will absorb it through the broken membrane, and the meat will potentially become non-kosher through that. And this is where we'll hold it for today. You all have a wonderful day.